you would find there was not, at that time, a hamlet, village or town which was not covered by bus services.
Nearly all the rail services which we intend to cut out run parallel with bus services. And even where they don't, it's very much cheaper to run a bus instead of the railway.
But as far as the politicians were concerned, a comprehensive bus service was never on the cards. Richard Marsh was later a minister, when the provision of buses was on the government's agenda.
Beeching was desperately the whole time looking for something specific on it.
To offer?
Yeah. And it wasn't there.
I mean, were the Cabinet aware that it wasn't there, that the buses wouldn't materialise?
Oh, yes, I think everybody did.
It was just a sop?
Yeah.
The government's vision of future transport lay elsewhere. In the same way that the train defined the Victorian era, the car was the ultimate expression of the 20th century. A symbol of modernity for an individualistic age.
The car from the mid-1950s was, apart from anything else, and beyond a means of transport, a consumer dream. It was something you could own. You can't own a railway. A railway takes you where the railway goes. A car takes you where, theoretically, where you want to go. And the idea of having some exciting little Ford Anglia or Ford Prefect with its plastic seats was a terrific dream.
But even before today's environmental fears, the downside of car culture was apparent. Traffic congestion was a serious problem, even when Beeching published his report. Aware of this, the lines he chose to keep were often commuter links or intercity routes, taking people in and out of the big urban centres. Yet Beeching's efforts to ease congestion would make little impact in the big scheme of things. The national transport strategy was, of course, in the hands of Ernest Marples, minister and sometime road construction magnate. And he believed not in trains, but in tarmac.
Whilst we can squeeze the last ounce out of our existing roads by traffic management and traffic engineers, the solution ultimately to the problem must be new roads.
The section of the M6 was opened by Mr. Marples, adding 27 miles to the northern section of the Birmingham-Preston motorway. The minister, as always, entered into the spirit of the occasion.
Some thought Marples' zeal for road building was, well, a bit dodgy. Amongst his critics was a recently launched satirical magazine. Aim of the Marples Master Plan: to run down all forms of transport in Britain, with the exception of the private motor car, so that Britain's roads become clogged to saturation. Thus far, Marples is acting in league with the motor cartels. Then will be his hour. His secret army of traffic wardens will take over all points of strategic importance, and Marples will assume supreme control of the national destiny. Well, got a bit overexcited at the end there, but actually, most of that is pretty prophetic. And that, of course, was Private Eye in 1962. And as the current editor, I'm very impressed that my illustrious predecessors had got Marples' number quite so early.
Until today,
the man who'd built, financed and championed roads was never going to be sympathetic to the railway's case, though he made a reasonable show of it in public.
It looks to outsiders rather as though if Dr. Beeching says close it, that's it.
oh, not a bit of it, not a bit of it. Dr. Beeching, with whom I'm in very friendly relationship, cannot close a line that's subjected to a passenger line. Only the minister, on behalf of the government, can do that. And I go into the evidence very carefully.
Beeching's job was strictly to identify the financial case for closure and leave it to politicians to decide whether there was a social case for keeping a line or a station open. In 1964, with an election looming, Labour leader Harold Wilson saw votes in stating his commitment to that social case. He pledged to halt major rail closures, whilst he worked out his own transport policy.
In Hislop and in Hull, immediately before the general election, the Labour Party were saying, we will reopen these lines next week if you vote Labour. Of course, immediately after the election, there was a hurried attempt to redefine the words major and halt so that they could say they had halted major rail closures without actually having to do that.
Once in power, Wilson, unsurprisingly, saw the merits of Beeching's plan after all. He was on his own mission to modernise Britain. But there were times when he found the political price of closures too high.
We had an argument about the Welsh lines, which were doing very, very little at that stage. And Beeching's attitude to that was, well, you just shut things down. And then it eventually went to the cabinet as to what we would do. After I'd finished, there was a complete silence. And George Thomas in those days, who was our friendly Welshman, said, "Prime Minister, we can't do that." And Harold Wilson said, "What do you mean you can't do it?" "It goes through 7 marginal constituencies," he said. And I think if he'd been there, I think he would have just exploded.
Beeching had no sympathy with such trifling conflicts of interest. He was resolute that if followed rigorously, his plan would deliver.
Beeching was mesmerised by the idea that there could be a core railway that was profitable, and therefore if you cut enough branches you'd get a railway that could then pay for itself forever. But really that's a myth.
It was a simplistic way of doing economics. There's a railway with 2 lines, we'll take one out and we'll save 50% of the cost. Well, I'm sorry, it isn't like that. You still have to maintain all the bridges, all the drains, everything.
Right.
Railways are really an onion, and if you strip bits off, you never, well, until you've destroyed it, get to a profitable core.
Private Eye at the time made it clear that they thought Dr. Beeching's policy of removing the branch lines from the main body of the railway was pretty silly, and they illustrated this with a cartoon of Dr. Beeching himself, in which he does his job, cutting down the railways, and then they remove his extremities, so they cut off his arms and his legs, and they then say, well, look, with his arms and his legs cut off, he's not much use, so let's sack him. So they do. A bit of satirical exaggeration there. Beeching wasn't fired. However, in 1965, he left British Railways by mutual agreement with the government. As he laid down his axe, he picked up a peerage and returned to ICI as Lord Beeching of East Grinstead, a town which had kept its station.
Hi. Can I have a single tomato bone, please?
He'd been hired to rationalise the railways.
£7.30.
But, as it turned out, his methods weren't quite as rigorous as he'd thought.
Beeching was mocked in a letter to the Times as a very efficient, very expensive computer. But it was because he lacked the number-crunching skills of a good computer that he got some of his calculations wrong. Nowadays, with electronic ticketing, you know where and when a ticket was purchased, and computer modelling allows you to predict passenger behaviour. In his day, everything was entered in ledgers by hand, and collecting exhaustive ticketing information simply wasn't feasible.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
But even with more accurate figures, many of Britain's railways would still have been doomed.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
There's no doubt that Britain had too many railways after the Second World War. There were some branch lines that had really been built on very shaky economic grounds and been losing money for years and years. But I think it's possible to say that's maybe something like a third of the mileage that